The crack of the bat echoed through Memorial Stadium like a gunshot. And for one impossible moment, the entire town of Millbrook, Alabama, held its breath. Malik Thompson stood frozen at home plate, watching the white blur of the baseball disappear into the Friday night lights, carrying with it 16 years of invisible dreams and empty bleachers. The roar that followed wasn't just for a home run, it was the sound of a community finally waking up to what had been right in front of them all along. 3 months earlier, those same bleachers had been as empty as a church on Monday morning, with nothing but the echo of Malik's cleats and the distant cheers from the football field next door. He'd grown used to playing to an audience of sparrows and the occasional groundskeeper, his talents buried under the weight of a town that lived and breathed nothing but Friday night football. But sometimes, the most powerful stories begin in the silence, in the spaces between what people see and what they choose to ignore. This is the story of how one swing of the bat changed everything, not just for Malik, but for an entire community that learned you can't measure heart by the size of your crowd. It's about the invisible battles fought in empty stadiums, the dreams that refuse to die even when no one's watching, and the moment when persistence finally meets its reward in the most spectacular way imaginable. Hello my friends, before we continue our story, leave your like, share the story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Millbrook, Alabama was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody, and what everybody knew was that football was king. Population 8,200, tucked between cotton fields and kudzu-covered hills, the town had produced 3 Division I quarterbacks in the past decade and enough Friday night legends to fill a book. Main Street was lined with faded murals of championship teams, and the water tower proudly displayed home of the Fighting Eagles in bold red letters. If you drove through town during football season, you'd think the whole place shut down on Friday nights, and you'd be mostly right. The Thompson family lived in a modest ranch house on Maple Street, where Malik's mother, Sandra, worked double shifts at the county hospital to keep the lights on. His father had been gone since Malik was 8, leaving behind nothing but a worn leather baseball glove and a collection of Atlanta Braves cards that Malik treasured like family heirlooms. Sandra Thompson was a woman who believed in hard work and keeping your head down, but she also believed in letting her son chase his dreams, even if those dreams seemed to run counter to everything their town valued. "Baby, you play that baseball if it makes you happy," she'd tell him. Even though she rarely had time to watch him play, Bollock had fallen in love with baseball the first time he'd held his father's glove. The leather soft and shaped by thousands of catches. While other kids in town were learning to throw spirals and run routes, Malik was in the backyard practicing his swing against a tee made from a traffic cone and PVC pipe. He'd spend hours watching Braves games on their old tube television, studying Hank Aaron's stance and dreaming of playing in Turner Field. His bedroom walls were covered with baseball cards and newspaper clippings, a shrine to a sport that his town barely acknowledged existed. The Millbrook High School baseball team was an afterthought, a spring sport that existed mainly because the state required it. They practiced on a field that doubled as the football team's winter conditioning space, with bases that were more dirt than bag and a backstop held together with duct tape and prayers. Coach Martinez, a soft-spoken man who taught Spanish and had played semi-pro ball in his younger days, did his best with what he had, but the school's athletic budget went to football first, basketball second, and everything else fought for scraps. The baseball team got hand-me-down uniforms and equipment that had seen better decades. When Malik tried out for the team as a freshman, he was one of only 12 boys who showed up, barely enough to field a team. The tryouts were held on a Tuesday afternoon while the football team was lifting weights in the new facility next door, their grunts and clanging metal serving as a constant reminder of where the town's priorities lay. Malik stepped into the batter's box with hands that shook slightly, gripped the aluminum bat like his life depended on it, and proceeded to drive 3 straight pitches over the makeshift fence. Coach Martinez just smiled and wrote his name on the roster without another word. But making the team and mattering to the town were 2 entirely different things. The baseball schedule was buried in the back pages of the local paper, if it was mentioned at all. Games were played on weekday afternoons when most folks were at work, and the few people who did show up were usually parents of players or students serving detention. Malik's mother tried to make it when she could, but her work schedule rarely allowed for afternoon games. He'd look up into the stands between innings and see maybe 8 or 10 people scattered across bleachers that could hold 200. Their conversations and cell phone calls echoing in the empty space. The loneliness of it all settled into Malik's bones like Alabama humidity, ever present and impossible to shake. He'd watch the football team's Friday night games from the parking lot sometimes, marveling at the packed stands and the electricity in the air, wondering what it would feel like to play in front of people who actually cared about the outcome. But come Monday afternoon, he'd be back on the baseball field, taking ground balls and working on his swing, because the love of the game burned brighter than his desire for recognition. Even if no one was watching, even if no one cared, Malik Thompson was going to be the best baseball player Millbrook had ever seen. Asterisk, by his sophomore year, Malik had grown 4 inches and added 20 pounds of muscle from countless hours in the makeshift weight room behind the equipment shed. His batting average had climbed 2.387, and he'd stolen more bases than anyone in the county. But these accomplishments were recorded in scorebooks that nobody read and celebrated by teammates who rode the same yellow bus home that dropped them off at neighborhoods where baseball was just something that happened on TV. The disconnect between his growing skills and the town's indifference had become a constant ache. Like a bruise that never quite healed, the turning point came during a conversation with his mother over leftover pizza on a Tuesday night in March. Sandra Thompson had just finished a 16-hour shift at the hospital and was too tired to cook. But she made time to ask about his day, the way she always did. "How was practice, baby?" she asked, and something in Malik's face must have given away his frustration, because she set down her slice and really looked at him. "You know what, Malik? I've been thinking I need to start coming to your games. My boy's out there playing his heart out, and I'm missing it." "Mama, you don't have to do that," Malik said, though the hope in his voice betrayed him. "I know you're working, and it's not like there's anybody else there anyway." But Sandra Thompson was already shaking her head, that stubborn look coming into her eyes that Malik knew meant her mind was made up. "No, sir, that's exactly why I need to be there. If my son is good enough to be on that field, then somebody better be in those stands cheering for him, and if it's just me, well, I'll cheer loud enough for everybody." That conversation planted a seed that began to grow into something larger. Malik started thinking about the other kids on the team, Tommy Rodriguez, whose parents worked 2 jobs each, Marcus Johnson, who was being raised by his grandmother, Danny Kim, whose family had moved to town when his father got a job at the paper mill. These were good kids, talented kids, who deserved better than empty bleachers and second-hand equipment. They deserved to matter, to be seen, to have their community recognize their dedication and skill. The idea came to him during a particularly brutal practice where they were working on fundamentals with baseballs that had been restitched so many times they looked like patchwork quilts. What if he could find a way to make people care about baseball in Millbrook? What if he could show them that the sport had its own kind of magic, its own moments of brilliance that were just as worthy of celebration as any touchdown pass? The challenge seemed impossible, but Malik had always been drawn to impossible things. He started small, asking Coach Martinez if he could write a weekly column for the school newspaper about the baseball team. The paper's editor, a senior named Jessica Walsh, who was dating the football team's quarterback, looked at him like he'd asked to write about competitive sheep shearing. Baseball, really? Does anyone even read about baseball anymore? But something in Malik's earnest request must have touched her, because she agreed to give him a chance. His first column was titled, "The Invisible Team," and it talked about the dedication it took to practice every day for a sport that most people forgot existed. The column generated exactly 3 comments on the school's website. But Malik wasn't discouraged. He kept writing, kept trying to capture the poetry of the game, the way a perfectly turned double play could be as beautiful as any piece of art, the way a stolen base required intelligence and timing and courage. He wrote about his teammates, their backgrounds and dreams, painting pictures of young men who worked as hard as any football player but did it without the promise of scholarships or local fame. Slowly, very slowly, people began to pay attention. The breakthrough came when Coach Martinez approached him after practice on a Thursday in April. "Malik, I've been talking to some folks, and there's a summer league starting up over in Montgomery. It's competitive, real competitive, and they've got college scouts who come through regularly. But it costs money: travel, equipment, league fees. I've been thinking about fundraising, but I wanted to run it by you first, since you've become kind of the voice of this team." Malik's heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. A summer league with college scouts. It was everything he'd been dreaming about. Everything he'd been working toward. That night, he sat at his desk with a legal pad and started making lists. He wrote down every local business, every civic organization, every church group that might be willing to sponsor a kid who was trying to make something of himself. He researched the summer league, learned about the other teams, the level of competition, the scouts who would be watching. For the first time in his life, Malik Thompson felt like he was on the verge of something bigger than himself. Something that could change not just his future, but the way his entire town thought about the game he loved. The question was whether he was brave enough to ask for help, and whether Millbrook was ready to invest in a dream that didn't involve Friday night lights. The fundraising campaign started with a handwritten letter that Malik spent 3 hours perfecting, copying it by hand 27 times to send to every business on Main Street. His mother had helped him with the wording, making sure he struck the right tone between humble and confident, grateful and determined. "Dear business owner," it began, "my name is Malik Thompson, and I'm a junior at Millbrook High School. I'm writing to ask for your help in supporting our baseball team's participation in the Montgomery Summer League, where college scouts will be watching young athletes like myself pursue their dreams. The responses were mixed at best. Miller's Hardware sent back a form letter declining to sponsor, though they included a coupon for batting gloves. The bank manager, Mrs. Peterson, called his mother to say she was impressed by his initiative, but that their sponsorship budget was already committed to the football team's new uniforms. 3 businesses never responded at all, and 2 others sent back notes that were polite but firm in their refusal. By the end of the first week, Malik had raised exactly $43, and felt like he was trying to fill an ocean with a teaspoon. The low point came during a game against Riverside High, when Malik went 0 for 4 and struck out with the bases loaded in the bottom of the 7th. The small crowd, maybe 15 people, including parents, was more interested in their conversations than the game. And Malik could hear someone's mother complaining about how hot it was and wondering why they couldn't just have air conditioning in the stands like the football stadium. As he walked back to the dugout after his final strikeout, Malik caught sight of his own reflection in the concession stand window and barely recognized the dejected figure staring back at him. But Sandra Thompson hadn't raised a quitter, and she made that clear during a conversation that night that started with ice cream and ended with tears. "Baby, you think Hank Aaron never had a bad game? You think he never struck out with people watching who didn't believe in him? The difference between champions and everybody else isn't that they never fail, it's that they get back up and try again." She pulled out a coffee can from the kitchen cabinet, filled with the tips she'd been saving from her weekend shifts at the diner. "I've got $237 here, and every penny of it is going toward your summer league, if you want it bad enough to keep fighting for it." The gesture broke something open in Malik's chest, and he found himself crying harder than he had since his father left. But they were good tears, the kind that wash away doubt and leave behind determination. He hugged his mother and promised her that he would make every dollar count, that he would show her and everyone else in Millbrook that their faith in him wasn't misplaced. The next morning, he woke up with a new plan and a renewed sense of purpose. Instead of asking for handouts, Malik decided to earn the money through service. He created a lawn care business, offering to mow yards, trim hedges, and do basic landscaping for $10 an hour. His first customer was Coach Martinez, who hired him to clean up the baseball field and make it look more professional. Word spread slowly through the network of parents and teachers who had watched Malik grow up. And soon, he was working every weekend and most afternoons after practice. The physical work was exhausting, but it felt good to be earning his dream rather than begging for it. The Summer League registration deadline was approaching fast, and Malik was still $200 short despite working himself to exhaustion. His grades had started to slip, and his batting average had dropped 2.312 as fatigue began to affect his performance. Coach Martinez pulled him aside after a particularly rough practice and suggested that maybe they should wait until next year, when they'd have more time to prepare. Sometimes the best thing you can do is be patient. Malik Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither are baseball careers. But Malik wasn't ready to give up, not when he was so close. He had one more idea, one last desperate attempt to raise the money he needed. The annual Millbrook Spring Festival was coming up, and he'd heard that vendors could rent booth space for $50 and keep whatever they made. He proposed to his mother that they sell her famous sweet potato pies and his homemade lemonade, working the festival from dawn to dusk in hopes of earning enough to cover the league fees. Sandra Thompson looked at her son really looked at him. Don saw something in his eyes that reminded her of his father when he was young and full of dreams. "All right, baby," she said. "Let's bake some pies and see what happens." The Spring Festival booth was a revelation in more ways than one. Malik and his mother arrived at sunrise with 3 dozen sweet potato pies, 2-gallon jugs of fresh lemonade, and a card table borrowed from the church fellowship hall. They set up next to the dunking booth and across from the face painting station, in a spot that got maximum foot traffic but also maximum noise. By noon, they had sold every pie and mixed up 2 more batches of lemonade, and Malik was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were going to make it. But the real magic happened in the conversations. As people stopped to buy pies, they started asking questions about Malik, about his baseball career, about why he was working so hard to raise money for something most of them had never thought to care about. Mrs. Henderson, who owned the flower shop, mentioned that she'd never been to a baseball game but had heard from her nephew that Malik was quite a player. Mr. Jackson, the retired principal, bought 3 pies and told Malik that he'd been following his column in the school newspaper and was impressed by his writing as much as his athletic ability. The breakthrough moment came when Tommy Rodriguez's grandmother, Mrs. Santos, stopped by the booth with her church group. She was a tiny woman with silver hair and bright eyes who had immigrated from Mexico 30 years earlier and worked as a seamstress until arthritis forced her to retire. "Mijo," she said to Malik, "my grandson tells me you're trying to get to that summer league. He says you're the best player he's ever seen, and Tommy's seen a lot of baseball." She pressed a $20 bill into his hand and added, "But more than that, he says you're a good teammate, a good friend, that's worth more than any home run." As the day wore on, Malik found himself telling the story of the baseball team over and over again, how they practiced on a field that was more dirt than grass, how they played their hearts out for crowds that could fit in a living room, how they dreamed of college scholarships and professional contracts, despite having equipment that belonged in a museum. Each telling of the story seemed to resonate with someone new. And by the end of the day, Malik had collected not just money, but phone numbers, email addresses, and promises to come to the next game. The final tally was better than he'd dared to hope, $347 in cash, plus commitments for another $150 from people who wanted to contribute but hadn't brought enough money to the festival. But, more importantly, Malik had discovered something about his community that he'd never realized before. People weren't ignoring the baseball team because they didn't care about the kids. They were ignoring it because they didn't know the kids. They didn't know their stories, their dreams, their dedication. All it took was one conversation, one moment of genuine connection, to change everything. That night, as he counted the money for the 3rd time and updated his registration paperwork, Malik realized that he'd been thinking about the problem all wrong. He'd been focused on getting people to care about baseball, when what he really needed to do was get them to care about the baseball players. The sport was just a vehicle for the real story, which was about young people working hard to achieve their dreams, about the values that athletics could teach, about the power of perseverance in the face of indifference. The Summer League acceptance letter arrived 2 weeks later, and Malik read it 3 times before he believed it was real. He was going to play baseball at a level he'd only dreamed about, against competition that would push him to his limits, in front of scouts who might hold the key to his future. But even more than that, he was going with the knowledge that his community was finally starting to see him, to see his teammates, to understand that there was more than one way to bring honor to the town of Millbrook. Coach Martinez shook his hand and told him he was proud, but Malik could see something else in his coach's eyes. Recognition that the student had become something more than just a player. "You know what, Thompson? You've got the heart of a leader. This summer league is going to be good for your baseball skills, but I think you're going to come back here with something even more valuable. You're going to come back knowing that you can make things happen, that you can change people's minds and move mountains when you set your mind to it." The Montgomery Summer League was everything Malik had hoped for, and more than he'd bargained for. The competition was fierce, with players from all over Alabama and Georgia who had been recruited by college programs or were trying to catch the attention of professional scouts. Malik found himself playing against kids who had been featured in Sports Illustrated and others who had already committed to Division I schools. The first few games were humbling, as he struggled to adjust to the higher level of play and the intensity of the competition. But by mid-July, something clicked. Malik's batting average climbed 2.378, and he'd stolen 15 bases in 20 attempts. College scouts began showing up specifically to watch him play, and Coach Martinez started getting phone calls from recruiting coordinators who wanted to know more about the kid from Millbrook. The attention was intoxicating, but Malik never forgot where he came from or the people who had helped him get there. He called his mother after every game, sent updates to his high school teammates, and even started a blog to document his summer league experience. The championship game was set for the first Saturday in August, and Malik's team had fought their way through the playoffs to earn a spot in the final. The opposing team was loaded with talent, including a pitcher who had already signed with Auburn and a shortstop who was being courted by several professional organizations. The game was being played at Montgomery's Riverwalk Stadium, a beautiful facility that seated 7,000 people and regularly hosted minor league games. For Malik, it was the biggest stage he'd ever played on, and he was determined to make the most of it. The surprise came Friday night, when Coach Martinez called his hotel room and told him to look out his window. There, in the parking lot for stories below, was a caravan of cars and trucks from Millbrook, decorated with homemade signs and banners supporting the team. His mother was there, along with Mrs. Santos, the Rodriguez family, Coach Martinez's wife, and at least 30 other people who had made the 2-hour drive to watch him play. "Malik," his mother said when she called his room, "this whole town has been talking about you all summer. We couldn't miss this for the world." The game itself was a pitcher's duel for the first 6 innings, with both teams managing only a few scattered hits. Malik had struck out in his first at-bat and grounded out in his second, pressing too hard and trying to do too much in front of the crowd that had come to see him. In the top of the 7th, his team finally broke through with 2 runs on a double and a wild pitch, giving them a 2-0 lead that felt as fragile as spun glass. The opposing team answered in the bottom of the inning with a solo home run, cutting the lead to 2-1 and setting up a dramatic finish. The bottom of the 9th inning arrived with Malik's team still clinging to that 1-run lead. The opposing team's best hitter led off with a double, and suddenly the tying run was in scoring position with nobody out. The next batter worked a walk, putting runners on first and second, and the crowd was on its feet, sensing a comeback. Malik, playing center field, could feel the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders like a heavy blanket. This was at the moment that would define not just the game, but possibly his entire future. The third batter lined a shot toward the gap, in right center field, a ball that would score both runners and give the opposing team the championship if it got through. Malik broke at the crack of the bat, his cleats digging into the artificial turf as he sprinted toward what looked like an impossible catch. Time seemed to slow down as he extended his glove, his body parallel to the ground, the ball sinking fast toward the warning track. The stadium fell silent except for the sound of his footsteps and the thundering of his heartbeat in his ears. The ball settled into his glove just as he hit the ground, rolling over twice before coming to rest with the baseball still secure in his grip. The umpire's arms went up, signaling the out, and the stadium erupted in cheers. Malik lay on the ground for a moment, hardly believing what had just happened, before his teammates mobbed him in celebration. As he looked up into the stands, he could see the people from Millbrook going crazy. His mother, with tears streaming down her face, Mrs. Santos, jumping up and down despite her arthritis, and Coach Martinez pumping his fist in the air. For the first time in his life, Malik Thompson was playing in front of people who truly cared about the outcome, and it felt even better than he'd imagined. The ride back to Millbrook that night was unlike anything the town had ever experienced. The caravan of cars stretched for miles along Highway 31, honking horns and flashing lights, with the championship trophy riding shotgun in Coach Martinez's truck. Malik sat in the passenger seat of his mother's car, still wearing his uniform, the game ball in his hands, and a smile on his face that he couldn't seem to wipe off. "I'm so proud of you, baby," Sandra Thompson said for the 10th time, reaching over to squeeze his arm. "But I'm not just proud of that catch. I'm proud of everything you did to get here, every person you touched along the way." The celebration continued into the following week, with the local newspaper running a front-page story about the championship and Malik's spectacular catch. The story was picked up by regional sports networks, and suddenly college recruiters were calling from all over the South. Malik received scholarship offers from 3 different schools, including one from the University of Alabama that would have seemed impossible just a year earlier. But perhaps more importantly, the Millbrook High School baseball team found themselves with a waiting list of kids who wanted to try out for the following season. The lessons learned that summer extended far beyond the baseball field. Malik discovered that changing people's minds wasn't about forcing them to care about what you cared about. It was about helping them see the human stories behind the statistics, the dreams behind the dedication. He learned that communities were capable of remarkable things when they were given a reason to believe, and that sometimes all it took was one person willing to stand up and ask for help. The skills he developed as a fundraiser and advocate would serve him well in college and beyond, regardless of how far his baseball career took him. The following spring, Millbrook High School's baseball games were drawing crowds of 200 or more, with local businesses sponsoring the team and the town council approving funds for field improvements. Malik's younger teammates found themselves being recognized in the hallways and invited to speak at civic club meetings. The sport that had once been invisible had become a source of community pride, and the boys who played it had become local heroes. "You changed everything," Coach Martinez told Malik during senior night ceremonies. "You changed how this town sees baseball, how it sees itself, how it sees what's possible when people work together." When Malik graduated and headed off to college on a full baseball scholarship, he left behind more than just a legacy of athletic achievement. He left behind a template for how one person's persistence and vision could transform an entire community's perspective. The empty bleachers were full now, the equipment was new, and the dreams of future players seemed more achievable than ever before. Mrs. Santos, who had become the team's unofficial grandmother, put it best when she said, "That boy didn't just hit home runs, he hit hope runs, and they're still traveling." The last game of Malik's high school career was played on a perfect May evening, with the stands packed and the concession stand running out of hot dogs by the 5th inning. He went 3-for-4 with 2 RBS and a stolen base, but the statistics weren't what mattered most. What mattered was the little boy in the front row wearing a number 23 jersey, the same number Malik had worn, asking his father when he could try out for the team. What mattered was the recognition that sports had the power to unite communities, to give people something to believe in. To prove that with enough heart and determination, any dream was possible. As Malik rounded the bases after his final high school hit, he looked up into the stands and saw the faces of everyone who had supported him along the way. His mother was there, of course, but so were Mrs. Santos, the Rodriguez family, Coach Martinez, and dozens of others who had become part of his extended baseball family. The roar of the crowd was music to his ears. But even more beautiful was the knowledge that he had helped create something lasting, something that would continue long after he was gone. In a town where football had always been king, baseball had found its rightful place at the table, and Malik Thompson would always be remembered as the young man who made it possible.